Hello.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to session number 34 of Intelligent Speech 2020. I know, it's bananas. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce to you Emma Burnell, Director of Political Human. Her talk today surmises the following, quote, "Across the political spectrum, people are turning increasingly to podcasts to get their fix of news and analysis. Why is this medium so popular, and what do people get from listening to podcasts that other media can't provide?" In this session, podcaster and podcast addict Emma Burnell, who is host of House of Comments, Zeitgeist Tapes, and a regular guest on Midatlantic with Royfield Brown, will outline her research on the phenomenal rise of political podcasts. She wrote her dissertation on it. She's probably the world expert on just this subject. You have come to the right place. I just made that up. I don't know if there are any others, but you have come to the right place. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to get out of here. Emma Burnell, thank you so much for hosting.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really hope you find this interesting. I'm going to start. I've got a few audio clips that I'm going to play. So I'm going to start with one of those. Hopefully you will be able to hear them. Do type in the comments if you can't. So that should be...
I think there's a market for optimism. I think there's a market for serious ideas presented in an accessible way, but in depth. So kind of both of those things. So not too boring, hopefully, but, reasonably in depth. And, a market across the political spectrum.
Hello, and welcome to the House of Comments.
We hope you enjoy this. My other podcast. So that basically, for those of you who don't know, that was Ed Miliband. And Ed Miliband used to be the leader of the Labour Party. Had a reasonable shot of becoming the Prime Minister of the UK. And now Ed Miliband is a podcaster. And I thought it was really interesting that that's the place that he chose to go. So the reason I use that clip is, Ed is explaining there why he feels that podcasting is so important. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the difference. So my research was on UK political podcasts. And I tried to do it across the political spectrum. So, for example, I spoke to Matt Zarb-Cousin, who is part of the Novara media family, very left-wing. And his podcast is sort of equivalent to maybe Chapo's Trap House kind of stuff that you've got in the US. And then I also spoke to Mark Wallace, who at the time was doing a show called Mogcast, which was with Jacob Rees-Mogg, who is a very right-wing conservative politician. So it was trying to look at what they had in common, what they were both trying to achieve. But I also spoke to a number of more traditional journalists who have also taken up podcasting. And the tradition of political coverage has had kind of two real roles. Firstly, journalists are curators of the public space. So that it's them who say, well, this is what's actually interesting. This is what we should be talking about. This is how we understand our world. This is how we interpret your world for you. So they kind of set the agenda, but they act as watchmen on the politicians. It's their role to dig out scandals. It's their role to understand how, when things go wrong, what caused that to happen, and give us kind of the underlying elements of that. But as political coverage has become more and more about he said, she said, talking heads on either side of an issue, going at each other hammer and tongs, there just seemed to be less and less illumination happening. And journalism as well became very bite-sized. A story would have to be covered in a sort of 3 to 5 minute clip on the news rather than, and that's how most of us saw it. 24-hour news is actually every 15 minutes, roughly the same news come back to you for about 30 seconds. So people were missing that kind of much longer form of digging under the skin of an issue. So it's really something that was a definite missing in the market. So I'm going to play another couple of clips now with some more traditional journalists talking about why they...
To be candid, when Radio 4 first said, will you do a podcast? I thought, well, why aren't we doing this as a Radio 4 programme? when the idea of doing a sort of one-on-one interview was discussed, and the person in charge said, look, you'll take more risks, you'll be more experimental, you'll learn more if you haven't got the pressure of it being simultaneously on Radio 4. And podcasting, he said, which I now know but didn't at the time, is different. It's different for reasons you'll know all too well. A different type of person often listens. It's my kids' generation in particular are podcast addicts. They're in their teens and 20s. It's an in-ear experience rather than fighting the noise of the bath or the bacon frying or the car. And it is narrowcasting in the sense of you choose. It's the Netflix generation. It's the iPlayer generation of people who are choosing to listen to a particular show rather than just having it on and seeing if it's something they like.
So that was Nick Robinson, who was previously the political editor of the whole of BBC, and has since become one of the presenters of their flagship Today programme, which is the main source of news for many people in the UK. It leads the agenda because it starts every weekday. So it's very interesting that he really saw the difference between what he could do in a podcast and what he can do on the Today programme. And it's not that one is better than the other, but they offer very, very different things. Podcasts are unmediated in many ways. One of the things that I found in my research was that one of the ways that we are taking back control of our environment in many ways is actually by walking around listening to what we choose to listen to. Putting headphones in when you're in public is actually a choice. You are curating your own soundscape. And it also, and this is something that I think women particularly have related to, it gives you an element of privacy that you don't have. I'll give you an example. I was walking down the street the other day, looking like a total scruff bag, and a car literally pulled up to the curb next to me, and the guy was trying to get my attention. But because I had my headphones in, I could just go, oh, la, la, I'm in another world, you can't touch me. And that protection and that curation of your own space is something that people feel very strongly about with podcasts. So what that's led to is people feeling a real affinity with the people they listen to. I listen to podcasts from both sides of the Atlantic. So I listen to, for example, Political Gabfest is a favourite of mine. 3 really interesting and fun journalists talking about issues in depth. They always end with a bit of a fun cocktail chatter thing. And I feel like I know David Plotz. I know Emily Bazelon. I know John Dickerson. Of course I don't. If I walk down the street, I probably wouldn't recognise them because they're not on my TV in the UK. So I have no idea who these people are. And yet I feel a really strong affinity with them because week in, week out, I listen to them talk like friends for an hour at a time. And that's the other thing, is that there isn't a set length for a podcast, and that's something that Nick Robinson came back to again and again, because you don't have to stay to a particular timescape. You do then just get to explore an issue for as long as it takes. And if you run out of things to say, you stop recording. And if you don't run out of things to say, you keep recording. And hopefully that remains interesting. And you do need to have a certain amount of discipline. And I know me and Royfield are not great at that sometimes up in Midatlantic for anyone who listens to it. But it is important that you're there to get under the skin of something rather than to fill an hour. And that is completely the attitude that people have to political podcasts. The other key thing about podcasting is a very democratic medium. Anyone has, it's a very low barrier to entry. Now, that doesn't mean to say that you will definitely be listened to. It doesn't mean to say that your listenership figures will always be huge. But everyone can put something out there. And if you are good enough, you will get picked up. And that's, it's never who you expect. So, okay, Nick Robinson has his podcast that he puts out through the BBC. That's probably going to get picked up. But one of the biggest podcasts in UK political coverage is called Talking Politics. And it's a group of Cambridge academics talking to each other about politics. And then I've got one more clip for you from the host of that, who's David Runciman.
So the original goal was to suggest to people that you could have conversations in a university between academics about politics that were accessible and also different from journalists and what you might hear on the Today programme. Maybe more in depth, maybe more historical perspective, more, I mean, the other thought was we're living through a time where politics is interesting to almost everyone. So why not talk to scientists and novelists? And it doesn't have to be politicians, political journalists, commentators. And yeah, it was to show that you could do that in a way that doesn't have to be sort of sound different and elitist, but can be serious. We're very conscious of not trying to be the kind of experts. You know, there are lots of experts, but not because there's anything wrong with expert. It's important not to be the person who's sort of trying to present superior knowledge. So I think when people come across it, if they value it, it's because they feel they get something, you know, they learn something from it, but they're not being sort of preached at. I mean, if we persuade people to think that there's more to this question, that's great. That would be the point, in a way, that there's a question that people have a view on, and then if after 45 minutes of us, they think, not necessarily it's more complicated than that, but there's a kind of range of things that go to make this question what it is, that's great.
So that was David Runciman. When they originally started talking politics, the university were very sceptical, apparently, and they own it as the individuals. Now the university, of course, is all over it because it's been such a huge success. But no one thought it was going to be a huge success. You know, a bunch of academics sitting around talking is a hard sell before it happens. But actually, lots of people have felt that the need to have just that bit more clarity. It's not done, I would say, to a Cambridge level. Well, I mean, I wouldn't know, I didn't go to Cambridge, but it's never patronising. And I think that's really key, because one of the things that you can tell almost instantly in a podcast is when someone's being fake. When someone is, you know, you can just hear insincerity. And I don't think it matters what side of the political spectrum you're on. Nobody likes that insincerity. If it's just a grift, if it's just nonsense that you don't believe, then it just becomes unlistenable to. And you can't do that week in, week out. And you know, one of the key things that you have to do with podcasting, and Royfield will tell you this, is get stuff out regularly and get stuff out a lot. So it's really key that there's no point doing it unless you know that you want to be having those conversations once a week and have something to say on a regular basis. So one of the podcasts that I used to do on a regular basis was called House of Comments. And it was three of us. Myself, who's a Labour supporter, my friend Mark, who's a Lib Dem, or was a Lib Dem, Liberal Democrat, which is the sort of centrist party in the UK for my American audience, which is different from what you would describe as Liberal Democrats. It's always very confusing. And then our friend Nick, who is a Conservative Tory. And we used to do this on a fortnightly basis. And we just got so damn bored because the only conversation anyone was having was about Brexit. And it was just again and again having the same conversation. So we dropped it in the end. And that was actually the second iteration of that. And the first iteration had gone wrong because during the time of the coalition government between 2010 and 2015, we had done it, me and Mark, and Mark would defend the government and I would attack the government. And it was, that was a really interesting tension between the two of us. And then Mark left the Lib Dems because he hated what the government were doing. So I would then attack the government and Mark would go, yeah, I know. And that is not interesting to anyone to listen to. So I think there is a real balance to be found between having attention and a range of viewpoints, but also making sure that you've got interesting content to add. If you're just repeating yourself and you're just doing a podcast for the sake of doing it, then that's disrespectful to the listeners, and they know it and they can feel it. So people have different reasons for doing podcasts. In the UK, some podcasts, as I mentioned, are partisan. I'm going to play you a clip now of the two ends of that spectrum, the Mark and the Matt that I mentioned earlier.
I don't share Jacob's views on faith, and I don't share a variety of his views on social issues. We actually probably share a view that the state ought not to be the person, or not to be enforcing those views or not. But I and a lot of other Tories enjoy hearing somebody who simply says what they do actually think. I don't think there's a huge amount of veiling going on there, which clearly appeals to people.
There isn't really like a left wing like podcast that's kind of not mainstream as such, but like accessible. I think it's like a lot of the left is very intellectualized, and we're kind of more left populist, I think. So if you were like not really attuned to political discourse or anything, and you listen to our podcast, the idea is that you would be able to understand, what we were talking about. It's ambitious, but we want to like offer something that has the capacity or the potential to break out of the bubble. I think there's two aspects to it. It's like political education, which is really, really important on the left, because I think there's a tendency to, I just think we just take it for granted in the Labour Party why people are members. We don't really provide any kind of ideological framework to what it means to be a Labour member. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is an analysis of what's happening, and the left analysis, and arming people with the arguments. And hopefully we do that. People come up to me, say, really, really enjoy it, and it's really like valuable.
So that was my last clip. Hopefully you'll be glad to hear. So as you can see, both Mark and Matt, from very different ends of the political perspective, are using their podcasts to promote their ideologies and to promote partisan behaviour. Much, much, much bigger, but the obvious equivalent for that is Pod Save America and the whole Crooked Media family of podcasts, where they have both got an entertaining and informative product, but they use that product to get people into activism, and they have a lot of different activism activation points. So at the moment, I believe they're doing a sponsor a key swing state program where you can, and they've got very competitive over it. They've all adopted a different one, so that they've got a way of competing amongst themselves, which again is that entertainment part. One thing that the podcasts really managed to do is build a community of listeners. Listeners really feel an affinity with each other, and this has been happening for a long time. There was one of the earlier really successful non-political podcasts was actually a spin-off from a radio show. So they did a podcast of the radio show, but it had its own jingles. So it's the Adam and Joe radio show. And they had their own little jingles for the podcast. And the people who listened to that were so loyal and so familiar with it. And they had this game that they would play, Adam and Joe listeners, where if they went to a gig or even like a theatre show or something, someone would shout Stephen, and if there was another Adam and Joe listener in that crowd, wherever they were, if you didn't know them at all, they would shout just coming. And this became a phenomenon. Bands were noticing that it was happening at their gigs. It was called Stevenage, which is quite a fun joke if you know that there's a town in England called Stevenage. But that community was really tight-knit, and that's what Pod Save America have really cleverly done, is realise that they've got this community that care about Jon Favreau and Tommy Vitor and who wins that contest of their key states. They've probably got a favourite presenter. They want to be on John Lovett's team. So they utilised that for partisan purposes. And that's the same thing that Matt was talking about, something slightly different, which is political education, which he rightly says is a huge, huge issue for the left. There's a lot of sense that there isn't really an understanding of the left's analysis of the world. And so that's exactly what he's trying to put out there and trying to give people the arguments to make when they're out there fighting the good fight, the bad fight, depending on where you come from. So I think that in terms of why people listen to them, it does feel that two things. One, that we feel like we're listening into a conversation between two mates in the pub, but two really well-informed and interesting mates. And that sense of both familiarity but also being educated is a really gratifying sense. That in-depth understanding that we get from listening to a political podcast, coming away from something, as Luke has said in the comments there, the History of Ideas series on Talking Politics. has been so useful to me because I've been a political journalist for about 10 years. I've worked in and around Westminster for about 20 years. But I never did politics at university. So I don't know. I know my own sense of politics, but I don't know the academia. I never did the reading. So actually having that background has been so useful to me. And I think that more and more people are understanding that podcasts aren't just something we listen to and dispose of, but something that can be utilized in really interesting and new ways. And with that, I will take any questions that you have.
That's it. Okay, cool. I'm unmuted. All right. Hello. We've got a couple questions already. So the first one is from Luke Baxter. And Luke asks, who is your favorite political podcaster and why is it Helen Lewis?
It is so totally obviously Helen Lewis, although she's not political podcasting anymore. I miss Helen, actually. I really miss her on the New Statesman podcast. I thought that her and Stephen had a really interesting dynamic on that. I love David Runciman's voice. I'm afraid I'm a sucker for that kind of deep, rich academic voice. And as I said, his series on the history of ideas has been incredibly useful to me. In America, I love, I'd say, Political Gabfest is a favourite. I can't picture John Dickerson's voice without thinking of him holding a cocktail in a tuxedo. That's just what he sounds like to me. I'm trying to think. I think that it is really important. I tend to read around the political spectrum, but not necessarily listen around it. So I would say that it's probably worthwhile trying to check out some things that are not going to make you feel comfortable. The obvious one is Joe Rogan, but it's just too bloody obvious. Over in the UK, the Spectator podcast is really interesting, well worth a listen on occasion. And the Times Red Box podcast is really good. It kind of a centrist, slightly centre-right occasionally, but really grainy look. And these people, that they're at the height of political journalism. They've got the information. And what they do is, instead of going, here's some facts, just straight out, they're kind of like, well, this is why people are talking about this, and this is what this really means. And that's a really useful way of approaching things.
All right, our next question comes from Rob Coughlin, who's, good Lord, in Australia, where it's probably 4 a.m. at this point.
Whereabouts in Australia are you from, Rob? I was there in January.
Rob, you can answer in the chat on the right here. Rob asks, in Australia, there's been a rise in satirical podcasts, mainly on the left. For example, Chaser, Friendly Geordie's Juice Media. And they also have companion YouTube and social media accounts. Is this also a trend that you're seeing overseas?
Yes, there are a few satirical podcasts, and there are a few comedians who are making podcasts who are sort of drifting further and further into politics. Oh, Perth! I was in Freo. I was in Freo to see my brother become an Australian citizen. But I digress. So yeah, there's the political party, which Matt Ford does. Matt Ford is a comedian, but he actually interviews people quite straight. A guy called, I've only seen his name written down, so I'm absolutely going to say this wrong. So my apologies in advance to anyone who's Irish, which I believe is an Irish name. It's Tiernan Dewab. He has a podcast, which the name is completely escaping me right now, but look him up on, if you can work out how to spell that, look him up on Twitter, because he's really, really good. And then you've got people like Richard Herring. So Richard Herring's Leicester Square Theatre podcast has been going for a really long time. And he interviews 2 people a night and does 2 podcasts, basically live in the Leicester Square Theatre, obviously. And he started off just doing comedians, but he's actually drifted more and more into interviewing politicians and journalists. And that's really interesting because he's quite irreverent. He has this list of emergency questions, he calls them, which are just, when you run out of other things to say, you can go to the emergency questions. And one of them is, and I apologise for anyone who is of a more sensitive soul, can you suck your own willy? I'm going to say willy because it's nicer. So yeah, and I was wondering, so when he started interviewing politicians, I was wondering how far he was going to go. Now, he actually has reined it in quite a bit. Didn't ask Jess Phillips that, funnily enough. But it is really interesting to have that different perspective and that different approach, because I think a lot of the rhythms of a political interview are kind of set, and you get taught them when you get taught journalism. And actually having someone who's just got a completely different approach really will elicit a lot more interesting responses, just because people haven't, the politicians aren't used to being asked those questions.
Do you mind if I butt in with a question of my own?
Please do.
All right, thank you. So I'm a small fry political podcaster here in the U.S. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is there a journalistic standard or journalistic integrity movement among political podcasters that's starting to emerge, kind of like what we saw in the transition from like the very Wild West nature of newspapers over to a news media that had a lot of journalistic integrity naturally, or not naturally, but kind of agreed to industry wide. And then of course, going to TV and online media, that the Wild West is here. Is there any thought about consolidating around a similar kind of movement towards standards of integrity?
It's a really, really interesting question. I think there's quite a lot of resistance to podcasting being regulated in the same way that, say, broadcasting is. And I think there are definitely two different types of audience. There are the audience who just want to be told what they already believe, and they are well fed through hyper-partisan podcasts. Mark and Matt's are both good examples of that. You're not going to tune in to listen to Jacob Rees-Mogg unless you like Jacob Rees-Mogg and agree with at least some of what he says. Equally, Novara Media, hyper-partisan, not just in terms of this party they support, but in terms of the faction within the party they support. So they were very, very aligned with Corbyn, very cross with Keir Starmer. And that's what you'll get. You're not going to get a kind of, well, actually, these are the issues. Here's the grey areas between the black and white. Then on the other hand, you have the much more media traditional podcasts like the New Statesman or the Times or the Guardian do a lot of podcasting. So you kind of get your flavour of politics, but in a way that I think would hold up to integrity and that would examine things from different perspectives. But I come back to that that authenticity point. Week in, week out, if you're not saying what you think, and you get stuff wrong and you're proved to get stuff wrong, then people will just stop trusting you, because trust is a huge, huge thing with podcasts. If I know somebody's got something wrong on a podcast, it bothers the hell out of me, because I'm like, well, that's the one thing I did know about. What about all that stuff I don't know about that I've been taking your word for? So it's really hard once trust is lost to be regained. So you might, if you decide to go down the hyper-partisan route, then you will retain the hyper loyalty of a small audience, but you will not be taken seriously more widely. Does that answer your question?
It does. And I'm wondering if with the, with hyper-partisan podcasting being a probably the more popular, or maybe it is, maybe it isn't, like, is hyper-partisan podcasting the more popular version of independent political podcasting? And if so, do you think, or have you seen evidence of some sort of impact that might be having on the electorate in, Britain or elsewhere?
I think it had it's hard to separate out the podcasting hyperpartisanship from all the other hyperpartisanship that is having an effect all over the place. I would say that the difficulties in the Labour Party over the last 5 years have in part been wound up by various media actors on both sides. I'm not, nobody has been perfect in this. I'm not here to take a side or to open that can of worms. But I do feel that the COVID crisis seems to have really abated people's hunger for that. So although you'll get a bit of it and some of it on Twitter. I think people are kind of tired of fighting that battle now, and they're looking for something else. And that's where maybe an independent, non-hyperpartisan, but maybe has a side, but is willing to explore around it. I think that's a much more attractive proposition for people at the moment.
Sorry, I was muted. And we've got another question from Rob Coughlin, who asks, these satirical pods really drive those politicians on the right crazy, especially Juice Media, who run honest Australian ads. They tend to shut them down. They run and keep patrons though to stay honest and keep the trust. Oh, sorry, it's Rob. Sorry, I realized that was a comment. Feel free to follow up. Is there any question you wanted to ask about sort of these attempts to shut the podcast down, or kind of the fight for funding? I'll wait for a minute for him to answer. And I think we've got
my Doctor Who shelves are invisible. My TARDIS and all my doctors.
Yeah, I noticed. Do you have every doctor up through a certain?
I haven't got a Jodie yet because my friend used to buy me all my Doctor Who's, and he hasn't got me a Jodie yet, so I need to nudge him.
Okay. That's now on record.
Yeah, absolutely, Tim. If you're watching. Tim also does podcasting, but he does podcasting on obscure TV. So we talk past each other a lot.
Okay, I'm gonna see if I'm gonna give Rob a beat. Oh wait, here we go. The funding tends to come from patrons. Okay, so one of the things I think we can pile on with Rob's point here is there, for political podcasts, is there, especially like independent ones versus ones run by like newspapers that already exist, is there have you noticed any kind of survivability or evolution of different forms of being funded? So I anticipate someone who depends on advertising might be vulnerable to like making a political correctness error on kind of either side's perspective and losing that funding. So do these podcasts tend more towards being patronized, or do they tend to get sponsors that are able to stay with them because those sponsors are friendly to that kind of partisan culture?
I think that you do get sponsors that kind of know what they're getting into, but it's fascinating. I remember listening to a very right-wing podcast. I think it was I can't remember. It was one of your American right-wing commentator guys, and the ads were the same products as I heard in middle of Pod Save America. And I just thought, wow, that's fascinating, because you'd sort of think, oh well, these products are particularly aimed at metropolitan liberals, and these products are particularly aimed at maybe working class rural white folks. But actually, they're all unpacking their Casper mattresses, and they're all getting their box fresh flowers and what have you. And that for me was really interesting, because it just undercut the basic fact that at the end of the day, for a lot of people, this is a business. I have said I've never made a bean off of podcasting. I do it for love, mad as I am. But I think there is a real, I think you have to be really upfront when you do start taking advertising, what impact that could or could not have on you. And if you do think it's going to silence you on certain issues, are you okay with that? Is that the trade-off that you're willing to make? Or if you're not willing to make that trade-off, is you being difficult on some issues a trade-off that your sponsor is willing to take? I think a lot of people do go down the Patreon line because, again, it's that community. It comes back to the Stevenage people. We would have happily paid a certain amount of money a month to Adam and Joe. I pay Richard Herring £1 a month. He's got a brilliant club where you pay £1 a month and you get a badge, and he sends you an email and you get first dibs when the tickets are released. So I think people are more and more willing to support things they love, and because we get this very close sense of a relationship with the people we listen to on a podcast, that is quite an easy way to monetize that.
Awesome. Thank you. I don't see any.
Maybe you can get some more sponsors now or some more Patreons.
Yeah, exactly. I appreciate it. I don't currently see any more questions, and we've actually only got a couple minutes left anyway, so I may not squeeze anyone for any because I want to make sure everyone gets to the. We've got, I think, two or three left. I think
I've got a glass of wine in the fridge waiting for me. So.
Yeah, exactly. Oh yeah, it's late your time.
No, it's not weird. My time.
It's not Australia time. Emma, I want to, on behalf of the audience here, I want to thank you so much for hosting this talk. Before we go, can you share with us where you're podcasting most these days, where we can hear more of your stuff?
Absolutely. So there'll be an episode of the Zeitgeist Tapes dropping in the next couple of days. It's a monthly podcast, and if you just look up Zeitgeist Tapes, we're on Audio Boom. We're doing so. Zeitgeist Tapes is a podcast where we look once a month at how popular culture covers politics, and we do that in a range. So we usually take a piece of work and look at it. This month, for very obvious reasons, we're doing Spike Lee films. And we had a special guest on because I do that with a partner who is called Steve Fielding. He's a professor of political history in Nottingham, and he's as pasty as I am. So we got on a really fascinating activist from New York to come and talk to us about what Spike Lee meant to him. But we've covered things as varied as A Very British Coup. That was a very early one that we did. And Dirty Dancing, which I contend is the most political film of the 1980s. And Steve has been convinced of this now.
Wow. Any other? I know you've got a few shows. Any other shows you want to point us towards that you're active with now?
Well, the main one, of course, is my lovely Midatlantic with lovely Roy Field. I'm also a regular on Democratic 2020, which is a fascinating weekly podcast originally about the Democratic primary and is now about the election. And that's hosted by Karen Robinson, who's big in Democrats Abroad and happens to live around the corner from me. And we always sing Hamilton, so I warn you in advance.
Awesome. All right. Let's let everyone go so they can grab a quick bathroom and water break before their next for the next couple shows. Emma, once again, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure to be your admin. Enjoy your glass of wine, and I look forward to listening to Zeitgeist Tapes. I appreciate you turning me on to that.
Brilliant. Take care.
All right. Cheers, everyone.